Hi, my name is Brian O'Dwyer, and I founded InteDashboard to make team-based learning easier, better, and accessible. Welcome to Introduction to Team-Based Learning. I'm a pilot by hobby, and one of my favorite places to land an airplane is at Kalaupapa Airport on the island of Molokai in the Hawaiian Islands. When you're a pilot and you're trying to land an airplane, you have a landing objective. And the two most important things you need to know when you're landing an airplane are this. You need to know if you're too high or too low, too fast or too slow. As educators, we don't have landing objectives, but we do have learning objectives for our students. And I would argue that we also need to know if we're too high, too low, too fast, or too slow. As pilots, we get detailed information in the cockpit, which gives us real-time data. And as educators, I argue we'd also benefit from the same sort of information. This is one of the ideas that inspires me. By way of background, I'm a team-based learning educator, entrepreneur, enthusiast, and parent. I started teaching with team-based learning in 2015 at Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University's Asia campus in Singapore. I've taught airline management, airport administration and finance, and aeronautical science, all using team-based learning. I'm also a team-based learning entrepreneur. I used to be an entrepreneur at residence at Duke, National University of Singapore Medical School, where I helped found a company called CogniLearn, which built a software for team-based learning called InteDashboard, which stands for Intelligent Dashboard. I'm also a team-based learning enthusiast. I've done over 100 talks, conferences, presentations, posters about team-based learning. And most importantly, I'm a team-based learning parent of 4 young children. After this workshop session, participants should be able to 1, define team-based learning, 2, describe the benefits of team-based learning, or TBL, and 3, explain how to get started with TBL. Larry Michelson originated the TBL methodology in the 1970s when he was a professor at the University of Oklahoma teaching marketing. His class size increased, and he wanted to find a way to make the class more engaging. Today, TBL is used by hundreds of institutions globally, mostly universities, but also some K-12 schools and some workforce training organizations. If you go on Google Scholar, you'll see over 9,000 entries for team-based learning. The team-based learning process works like this. It starts by relegating the lecture to pre-work, 85% of which is forgotten anyway. Students can do that with videos, slides, or some other form of text. When they come into class, they take an individual quiz to see how well they learn material on their own. They follow it with a team-based quiz with immediate feedback, which usually increases the outcomes by about 20%. And then the instructors can clarify any doubts with the basic theory. At this point, students are sort of ready to learn and sort of on a similar basic understanding of theory to apply what they learned in the second half of class to apply it to relevant problems, which bridges theory with practice. In addition, there's a 360-degree teammate peer evaluation process that drives accountability and better team dynamics. Starting with pre-work. Pre-work can be anything in the form of textbooks, could be written materials, presentation slides, recorded videos. In my class, we're lucky enough that the Federal Aviation Administration publishes a handbook. You can just download it on the FAA website, and you can actually I just assign chapters out of that. I also give my students priming questions to make it a little bit easier for them to understand. What I found is that a lot of students sometimes prefer reading versus videos because they can generally read about 3 times faster than they can listen. And when some of my colleagues at Duke were involved in Coursera, they found a lot of research that about 80% of learners prefer downloading slides and reading transcripts than going through the whole listening process. From a faculty perspective, I also found that sometimes recording videos takes about 3 times longer because you have to prepare this presentation materials on your own, record it, listen to it, and edit it, which can be pretty time consuming. But with the pre-work, it can absolutely be curated. It does not need to be created. Now, when students come into class, they start with an individual readiness assurance test, or IRAT, or individual quiz. This is really designed to make sure that students understood the content material they did before, but it also provides an accountability feature. And when students are working, I actually have a little real-time dashboard with some of the software I built to see how they're performing on this assessment individually. After they take the individual readiness assurance test, they repeat the same exact test questions as a team in what's called a Team Readiness Assurance Test, or TRAT, which occurs with immediate feedback. So student teams, typically about 5 to 7 students in an in-person class, maybe about 3 to 5 students in an online class, will work together and they'll actually discuss each question and come up with a common team answer where they have to defend, debate, discuss amongst themselves, and they'll submit that answer or that team answer to our system, get immediate feedback, and if they're correct or not. If they're correct, they get full marks, they move on to the next question. If they're incorrect, they retry for partial credit and keep going till they get the correct answer. I love what it does in terms of perseverance, but I also love the concept of immediate feedback because it helps them learn as they're taking the assessment. For example, I love to play golf. And if you go to the driving range and hit the ball, but don't find out where it lands for days or a week later, you're not going to learn as effectively. That immediate feedback process really helps. And I think it also helps the team dynamics to know that, hey, we just went through this, and maybe we should have listened to that person who's a little bit quieter. They were actually right. And so not only does it help the content knowledge, I think it actually helps the teamwork as well. Now, again, while students are doing this as a team, I'm looking at this dashboard to see how the teams are progressing. And the third step, or next step rather, is clarifications. Now, if your students are like mine, if I say, hey, who doesn't understand the thing that we just went through, I will basically get 0 responses, whether it's students not wanting to admit they don't understand or not being engaged or whatever the situation is, that just won't happen. So what we do instead is we ask which teams need clarification. It's not because you don't understand, maybe it's just you want clarification. And so what we do is this, I call it a little bit of a pedagogy judo, where we turn the fear of failure versus the fear of speaking in class on students to get them to engage and participate more. So what we do is we ask the students, or the teams, actually do it at team level, not an individual level, what their concerns were or what they need clarification of at this stage. And let's say we had team 1, the gunners are super ambitious and they think they know everything. And we have a confused team and we have a concept called density altitude. It's pretty difficult. What I'll do is we'll say, okay, team 1, since you don't have any concerns or clarifications, and another team is kind of confused on this point, why don't you stand up and explain it to that other team in front of the whole class? Now that does a couple things. First of all, the confused team gets an explanation and they get it actually in the words of students, which sometimes students might be better at explaining things to students than I am because they've learned it for the first time more recently. I learned about density altitude for the first time 20 years ago. The second thing it does, it also helps me confirm, did team 1, our gunners that think they know everything, were they actually right? Or they may have thought they were right, but really not, or maybe they got it right for maybe a wrong reason. And finally, the last bit, it gives a very strong incentive that if you're really confused on it, you better identify that you'd like clarification. Otherwise, your team could get called on to explain it. So I find this works really well. And for particularly difficult concepts, you'll see team 1, 2, 3, 4, all the teams will start putting up their hands saying, hey, we actually don't understand this, because nobody wants to get called on to explain it, which is great. We can really sort of suss out the trouble spots. In the next step, so the first half of class we had, or first part of class, we just wanted students to read on their own before, prepare. We come in and test them individually to see how well they learned on their own. Then we ask them to work in a team, and we test what they learned as a team with each other. And then we clarified any doubts with the basic theory. In this next portion, we want them to apply the theory or apply the content knowledge to solve relevant problems. In team-based learning, we use something called a 4S framework: significant problem, same problem, specific choice, and simultaneous report. And this is the part that really impressed me because this is so relevant to what our students need to do in the workforce. In my case, take the route from Sydney to Canberra, and which plane are we going to fly? Are we going to fly the ATR 72 turboprop or the E190 regional jet? And so for us, this is a significant problem. This is a real problem that we'll actually have to face in the workforce. Secondly, we want all the teams to work on the same problem. We don't want them to work on 10 different routes. We want them to all work on the same one so we can actually compare and contrast and get them to debate and defend their choices. The third element is specific choice. We don't want students to list pros and cons. You need to make an actual decision. And I love this because this is so much like the real world. We don't list the pros and cons of one plane for the other. We got to decide because the plane has to go. Or if you're a physician and you're treating patients, you got to operate or medicate, or amputate. You got to decide. You can't just list pros and cons. So this, I think, is really authentic for the workplace. And finally, the last piece, simultaneous report. We want all the teams to answer and report out their decisions at the same time. We do this with software. You can do it with voting cards, number of different ways to do it. Okay, team 1, 2, and 3, you said propeller plane. Team 4, 5, 6, and 7, you said jet. Okay, team 5, why'd you say this? Team 2, why not that? And it really provides a level of commitment to actually report out their answers publicly and have to defend them. And so it really avoids some things like, well, okay, that team said that. Okay, we'll say that too. So you really want to have them report at the same time. So this is the part I'm really sold on because it really bridges theory with practice. And the last part of team-based learning is a concept called peer evaluation. Now, I love this step because it actually is really authentic to what we do in the workplace. So just as in the workplace, we might every 6 to 12 months or more often, we might review our colleagues, give them feedback on their performance. We do the same thing in a team-based learning class. Typically do this about 3 times a semester, once at orientation, so students know what to expect, once in the middle, where it's a chance that's ungraded in a formative context, just for feedback to improve, and once at the end of the semester that counts towards a grade, like a summative assessment. It's about 10% of the grade in my class, so that it really does matter. And so it's really just a structured way for students to give feedback each other on how they contributed to the team. Now, different folks have different reasons for this. For me, it's absolutely about reinforcing the teamwork, giving and receiving feedback skill, because I think that's so critical to the workforce. Others think it's really helpful because it allows students to reflect on their own behaviors and evaluate what makes great team behaviors. And also some think that, hey, look, this is great because it really fosters a positive team dynamic, which improves everyone's learning. Now, there's a lot of different ways to do this in terms of how you do it and how you slice and dice it and what sort of questions you ask, but really relates to the 3 primary criteria, which is really about, do students come to class prepared? Do they show up in their teams? And do they contribute actively? Now, with that context in mind, I'd like to switch gears a little bit and talk about why team-based learning can be so compelling. Now, I used to have a coach that said, when you practice, you want to practice like you play. And I also like to think you want to learn like you work. And this was really a big selling point for me. So before education, I was chief financial officer of an airline. We grew from 400 to 800 employees in about 18 months, and then we sold the business to Virgin. And during that time, finding talent for a team was one of our biggest challenges. But I'd also knew some university students that were graduating and had a hard time finding a job. So I really wanted to focus on this problem. And so when I started teaching, I realized that this old lecture model is nothing like what we need students to do in the workplace. We don't need them to sit and listen to us talk for 3 hours. We need them to work as a team and solve problems. Hey, this situation came up. A volcano exploded in Indonesia. Okay, what does that mean to our route network? Well, that's not just a one-person decision. That might mean flight ops. It might mean commercial. It might be finance. It might be other parts of the organization, all working to solve a complicated problem. And that's what I've really admired about the team-based learning process. It got us so much closer to the workforce, and it prepared our students for those situations to succeed in their careers. So that's really what drew me. Now, from a more systematic level, a number of education conferences, I see these slides about the World Economic Forum, future job skills, and I agree with that, and that's great. And so when I look at some of these World Economic Forum skills, like working in teams, working with other people, I would argue that the team-based learning process, you'll at least meet half of these skills, if not more, and certainly much more than a lecture model of learning would. Now, I come at this from a workforce angle because that's my background, but a number of TBL educators come at this from an engagement perspective. And this is a class from one of our colleagues, and you see students are sort of zoning out. Somebody's asleep, a couple people on their phone, and it's just that lack of engagement. And so they wanted to find a different way that really engages students. Now, in the past few years, things have shifted to a lot of online learning, and that's made the engagement problem even worse. And that's really one of the things that team-based learning can do. Now, the other thing I love about it is it's just the higher order problem skills that it creates. One educator, Julie Estes, describes this as almost like riding a bicycle. You start out on your own, you're pedaling the bicycle in sort of a flat land, but as we go through the TBL process, we sort of up the level of difficulty and up the challenge, sort of like you're climbing a higher and higher hill. But you do that with your colleagues and your teammates, you're able to work on a little bit harder and harder things. And so others have found that this approach where you gradually build up the level of difficulty to get to the point where you're really going to much more higher order skills than perhaps a straight lecture. Now, when we did this in my class, what I found was a couple of things. First thing I found, if I compared how people did as individuals and how they performed as a team, the teams would always do better. In my case, it's about a little over 20% better, about 22%. The second thing I found is that the individuals retained the gains when they worked together as a team. So when I tested people on the midterm and final exam, those scores were much more closer to the team score than they did by themselves as an individual. And then the third thing I noticed is that the high-low range narrows. So before, we might have a wider range between the top student and the bottom student, but when we progress, that range narrows considerably. And I think that's so encouraging. I think that's because the top students will get a little bit better as they'll sort of explain more to the weaker students on their team. But the weaker students will actually do much better because they almost get a semi-personalized explanation of some of the materials. Now, when Larry Michelson studied this across 1,500 teams, he found a similar result, that the team outperformed the best individual more than 20%, by more than 20%. Now, there are a few considerations when adopting team-based learning. We see this in three sort of buckets, and we've worked with hundreds of institutions to support their team-based learning. It's usually the attitudes towards change of different stakeholders, the skills to facilitate active learning, and the bandwidth or the time to adopt materials to active learning. By far, the attitudes is the biggest challenge. If educators are willing or administrators are willing, you can absolutely get buy-in from parents and students and other stakeholders. But that is the critical one, is that attitude towards change. Skills to facilitate active learning, they absolutely can be learned. We launched a whole workshop and professional development program to help with that. And finally, the bandwidth to adapt materials, that can be done as well. But it's the attitudes that are the critical one. Now, when you go to design or build a TBL class, there's a concept called backward design. So the TBL class flow is experienced by the learners, goes from pre-work, IRAT, TRAT, clarification, application. But when you build it in the reverse. So the first step is really forming learning objectives. And then once you do that, is creating application cases or scenarios that if the teams can solve that case, you're confident that they met that learning objective. Then once you have those cases in hand, you select the pre-work or the content and materials that provide the basic theory or knowledge, so that if somebody has that knowledge, they are equipped to go apply that knowledge to solve the cases or scenarios. And finally, the fourth step is designing the readiness assurance test, or some people call it the multiple choice questions. And that's the quiz questions to make sure that if they get the quiz questions right, they really understood the content or the pre-work or the basic theory, so they're ready to solve the applications. And that's called backwards design. Now, if you'd like to learn more about team-based learning, you could certainly do some self-learning with readings, videos, lots of publications. One of the best ways, I think, is actually experience it as a student to feel what that process is like. And finally, connect with other educators in your field or related fields to see if that would work for your context. So in summary, TBL is a structured form of small group learning with a pre-work, an individual and team readiness assurance test, team applications, and peer evaluations. TBL can improve employability, engagement, and learning outcomes. Attitude, skills, and bandwidth should be considered. Get started, use a backwards design approach, self-learning, experience it as a student, and connect with other TBL educators. If you're ready to take the next step towards team-based learning, feel free to join some of our faculty development workshops or book a one-on-one consultation on how to get started with team-based learning. And you can learn more about our software platform at our website, www.InteDashboard.com, about how our software makes it easy to implement team-based learning. Thanks so much for your time, and looking forward to hearing from you and sharing more about team-based learning. Bye-bye.